Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing a fancy booktube hat, and today I am bringing you what I am hoping will be a fairly concise double series review. Now, it's been a little longer than normal since I've posted a video, and the reason is because I have been procrastinating filming this video that I knew had to be my next thing to post. This is going to be an overview of what I thought in general of two very popular series, the Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab and the Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo. I finished both of these long enough ago that I should have long since had series reviews up, but I feel sort of intimidated to do that when I'm talking about series that are, I guess, popular enough that I feel like all of the opinions have already been said, but I do think that I owe you guys at least a recap of what I thought of both of these series, what my take on them is. These are both series that I enjoyed, as I sort of hesitate to say guilty pleasures. They're both this sort of high-stakes, over-dramatic fantasy book that isn't too hard to read, that I can just kind of binge the book. And that is something I really enjoy, although it isn't necessarily the main focus of my reading most of the time. So I'm going to start with the Shades of Magic trilogy. These are by V.E. Schwab, who also writes as Victoria Schwab. They are adult fantasy with huge crossover appeal for young adult readers. This is where I feel kind of stupid repeating the same thing that everyone else has said already about the book, but the basic premise is there are multiple worlds. There are 4 worlds, and we are in London, and it is about the 4 interconnected Londons. Grey London is our world with no magic and like a Regency era setting. Red London is the capital of the Arnesian Empire in a world where magic flourishes. I would say that as the series goes on, it becomes increasingly clear that most of the story is about Red London. White London is a power-starved dystopia in a world where magic is scarce. And Black London, no one goes there, it was destroyed long ago. That world is like a wasteland. The central cast of the characters for the book is as follows. We have Kell, who is one of a very small number of Antari left. These are the only people who can travel between the Londons. He is sort of the adoptive son of the Arnesian king and queen, making him the foster brother of Prince Rai, who is another central character in the series. But Kell is pretty bitter about his family situation. We follow Leigh Bard, who is a thief in Grey London who ends up tagging along on a magical adventure that Kell winds up enmeshed in. Now, normally in a series review I would do something of like a little mini spoiler-free review of each book in the series. I'm not going to try to like review the first book in this series because it's been almost a year since I read it. That's way too long ago to be able to talk about the plot. What I remember is that I had a fun time reading this book, but also I had a lot of unanswered questions in this book that I was hoping that the rest of the series would address. And I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads initially on the condition that the rest of the series was going to answer my questions, which I sort of assumed it would. That ended up being an incorrect assumption, and I don't know if it was because I went into the first book with some inaccurate preconceptions of the sort of book I was getting into, or if I really am justified in thinking that this book set me up to expect something that it didn't deliver. One of the things I had heard widely praised about this series and about Schwab's writing was the world building, so I went in with very high expectations in that regard, and I was honestly a little disappointed. Yes, she manages to make 4 different worlds happen in one fairly short book, and each of them feels like, you know, a convincing fantasy world setting in its own way, although we never actually go to Black London. Its existence is significant. But I was really quite confused on several points. We're introduced to a vague history of the relations between the worlds and how they have gone downhill, but it is sort of taken for granted that London is the only point of connection between the worlds. I don't remember whether or not there was an attempt at an explanation at this, but if there was, it clearly wasn't satisfactory to me. It's sort of just taken for granted that the history of the relations between Londons in these worlds has shaped the landscape of magic across the entire worlds as a whole, even though we never actually see a lot of any of these worlds beyond London. And apart from that just being very Eurocentric, it raises a lot of logic questions for me. For example, the state of technology in these worlds seems to be such that, you know, I don't think anyone in them would actually know if there happened to be a community of Antari jumping between alternate South Americas somewhere, or, you know, alternate Chinas. And yet it's very clearly taken for granted throughout the whole series that the Antari that we know in these books, the characters we know, are the only ones in the entire world, and I find that questionable. I also felt very strongly that the first book was hinting that something about the nature of Antari and perhaps Kel's backstory was going to be fundamentally important to, you know, the understanding of the balance of power between the worlds. Maybe that was just my story predictor sense being wrong. I did like what the series eventually did with Kel's backstory, but it wasn't that. There are also questions raised in this series about Lila and what is she and is that possible? And those questions, while asked, never get answered at all. So while this multi-world premise is sort of an interesting setting, a landscape for these characters' escapades, I was initially expecting it to be more than that, for it to be sort of fundamentally part of the story in some way, and I didn't feel like it really lived up to that expectation for me. While I did really enjoy the rest of the series, when I got to the end of it and looked back on my promise that the 4 stars for that first book were conditional on several questions being answered, and that just clearly hadn't happened at all, I did in fact downgrade my Goodreads rating for A Darker Shade of Magic to 3 stars. So the first book in the series is A Darker Shade of Magic, the second book is A Gathering of Shadows. A Gathering of Shadows, I think, is complete filler fluff. I enjoyed every minute of it, even while sort of laughing at its absurdity. Pretty much all of this book is set in the world of Red London. It is focusing on a magical competition that really has nothing to do with anything except magical competition, why not, and it gets all of the characters eventually by the end of the book sort of maneuvered into the right place for book 3. Basically what happens in this book is that 2 characters we are following separately are both entering this competition in disguise. So there's like concealed identity and deception shenanigans, and also the question of when are these 2 characters actually going to like meet and talk to each other. This takes the entire 500-page book. I am not kidding you. It is totally outrageous, and I was kind of mad at myself for enjoying it as much as I did, but I did enjoy it. And book 3 in this series is where things happen. Book 3, I think, will please anyone who enjoys the first 2 books. I'd say that by the 3rd book, your cast of main characters has expanded from 3 to like 5, depending on who you count. And yeah, you get stuff from the other worlds in this book, but it's still really mostly about the world of Red London. It kicks off in high gear right at the start with evil magic stuff and a whole world needing to be saved, and it doesn't let up for 600 pages. There's some incredibly overdramatic, angsty writing that I kind of scoffed at a bit while actually enjoying thoroughly. There's magic, romance, sex, death, destruction, redemption. It's a pretty potent, exciting combination, and I think this is where Victoria Schwab excels as an author. I think this is really what she does best and why she's popular. This is the sort of book that like puts its characters through emotional hell for your enjoyment. This book made me care about characters in this series that I had not previously cared about. And yes. One of the things that I had noticed in the first 2 books in this series that continued very strongly in book 3 is that Schwab really likes to kill off side characters. Your main characters are for the most part pretty safe, I'd say, but don't get attached to any of the side characters because she kills them off on a pretty regular basis for the purpose of tormenting the main characters. This is another story technique that I'm not sure I 100% approve of, but I see why it works. And so for all that I felt like the series as a whole misdelivered in some ways, I really enjoyed the third book and I gave Conjuring of Light 5 stars. So while overall I'd say I enjoyed this series, I'm not particularly eager to dive into more of Victoria Schwab's work right now, but I'm glad I at least get what the hype is about. I took a break there to clear my brain out between series before moving on to Six of Crows. I hope you don't mind. We've lost our daylight, but I'm ready to go on. Again, the part where I have to give you the spiel that you've already heard a million times, but this is a young adult fantasy duology by Leigh Bardugo set in the same world as her Grisha Trilogy. This is marketed as a heist story. Caper might be more accurate as a slightly broader term. And while this takes place after the events of the Grisha Trilogy in a world that is partially shaped by those events, it is not necessary to read the Grisha Trilogy in order to follow Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, its sequel. They follow a completely separate cast of characters. Now, I did read the Grisha Trilogy back before I started BookTube, and I went into them knowing that Leigh Bardugo had written some short story-length folklore fantasy stories set in this world, and I was hoping for something along those veins, and I was disappointed in that regard. It really didn't go in a folklore fairy tale direction at all, but I still, you know, consumed it sort of mindlessly and happily. The days before BookTube when I read books and didn't have to think about them enough to talk about them to the internet. But the Grisha Trilogy was really formulaic in a lot of ways. In this world, the people with magic are called Grisha, and we followed a girl who had a very special Grisha power, and she was a chosen one, and we followed the course of events specifically in the country of Ravka. Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, however, take a more cosmopolitan outlook and give us a more unlikely cast of characters. I have held on to Crooked Kingdom, the second book in this duology, from the library, specifically so that I could show you the map in this book. Let me scooch my chair closer. So here's the map. The Grisha Trilogy took place almost entirely in Ravka, which is the Russian-inspired country in this world. To the north we have Fjerda, which is vaguely Nordic, and to the south we have Shuhan, which is vaguely Asian. Over on the other side of the True Sea we have Novi Zem and the southern colonies, which to me seemed to have a vaguely New World type feel. And up here we have the Wandering Isle, which seems to be Irish. These books, however, focus on Ketterdam, the capital city of Kerch, this little island in the middle bottom here. Kerch has an economy based on trade and a government run by merchants. The people in Ketterdam and the characters from these books come from all over this world. Of the 6 main characters of the title of the first book, 2 are from Kerch, although they come from vastly different socioeconomic backgrounds. One is from Novi Zem, one is Fjerden, one is Ravkan, and Inej is from Ravka, but she's not ethnically Ravkan, she is Suli, and they are a traveling people. And one of the things that Leigh Bardugo does in these books that's actually really refreshing is she shows how these characters feel about the representation of their cultures, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, the misrepresentation of their cultures in Ketterdam, in this society, and I think that's something that a lot of young adult readers will find really relevant. And of course, the main shift that Leigh Bardugo makes from something like the Grisha Trilogy to Six of Crows is in the types of characters she puts at the center of her story. This is an ensemble cast of characters who are all given weight and depth. And while some of the characters in these books are Grisha, that doesn't carry the amount of weight with regard to their significance in the story the way it does in the Grisha Trilogy. And in fact, the 2 characters that I would say are the primary protagonists of the series, Kaz and Inej, neither of them are Grisha. Both of them have extraordinary skill sets, but they are not magical, they are sort of self-made skill sets. Now the thing is, this is, let's call it a caper story, and and it centers around a group of teenagers who are members of a gang in Ketterdam who are supposedly like the best criminals to pull off this job that they are presented with in the beginning of the first book. And this is where some suspension of belief is necessary, especially if you are an adult reader and you are skeptical about all of these characters being teenagers. If you are a fantasy reader, though, you are probably already practiced at suspension of disbelief. But I think there is a reason that this sort of fantasy novel that has, like, a group of hardened criminals doing criminal stuff at the center is something that you see in adult fantasy, but not necessarily in YA. It just makes more sense. And I'll have to admit, this isn't a type of fantasy novel that I have read a lot of. I avoid this in adult fantasy just because it doesn't generally jump out as something that would appeal to me. Although I could name several adult series that I think are probably kind of like this. Anyways, what you need to know is Kaz Brekker is totally a criminal mastermind, and he assembles this team for this sort of heist. From his gang, the Dregs, and assorted contacts, this job will actually take them to Fjerda, although we don't get there until the latter portion of the book, and we spend a lot of the first book in flashbacks into all of these characters' backstories. And as I said in whatever wrap-up it was I talked about Six of Crows, like, gosh, each of these characters' backstories are, like, angsty and dramatic enough that they could have been a full young adult novel on their own. And of course, because this is angsty YA fantasy, everyone is neatly paired off in romantic couplings. All of those romantic couplings are pretty obvious fairly early on in the series, even if it does take a long time for them to, like, get off the ground and go somewhere. Good thing your heist crews come in even numbers, right? This is the other thing in this series that I find mildly absurd, but I don't really mind. So Six of Crows is all basically leading up to the completion of one particular challenging task. And then the question is, where does it go from there? Book 2. Book 2 continues to have something of a caper format, but it's less directed. In this book, the team is trying to manage the fallout of what happened at the end of Book 1. But there's less of a single clear goal, and the plans adapt and change more fluidly over the course of the book. I also thought that Crooked Kingdom had a stronger emotional payoff for anyone who has read the Grisha Trilogy than Six of Crows did. There are some crossover characters who show up as minor characters in this. Again, you don't need to have read the Grisha Trilogy to understand what's going on here, but there are things for fans to get excited about. As I was reading this book, I realized that there were some continuing themes from the Grisha Trilogy to do with religion and faith in this world. People from different countries who hold different beliefs, believe different things about the Grisha, who are the people with magic. Are they divinely blessed with these powers, or are they witches and unnatural and evil? This is a debate that drives conflict in this world. At the center of these books is a drug that has been developed that can alter Grisha powers, but is devastating to anyone who uses it. I think in this book, Bardugo is also trying to hone in on questions of what makes a person worthy. The characters in these books are all rejects of society in some way or other, and they've ended up meddling in something that ends up having incredibly far-reaching consequences. There's also, like, a whole ton of good old revenge versus forgiveness stuff. Anyways, this is a series that I found more consistent from start to finish than the Shades of Magic trilogy, but I never got quite as emotionally excited about it as I did by the end of A Conjuring of Light. I gave both Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom 4 out of 5 stars. So I hope when that's edited down that will become a fairly short overview of what I thought of 5 books. 5 very popular books in 2 different series. Let me know if you've read either of these series and what you think of them. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.